This is Sunday, May 11th, 2025, and I want to start off by wishing Happy Mother's Day to all the moms in our Sangha and beyond, including my own mom. When I started to think about what would be a fitting topic for today's Teisho, what immediately bubbled up was one of our Zen ancestors, Mother Moshan Liaoran. She was the first woman to be officially recognized in the Zen school lineage. And she's among the women included in a new chant in homage to ancestors that we'll soon be introducing and adding to our weekly schedule of chanting services. It's true that the recorded history of Zen ancestors primarily consists of men, but there were also women, both sung and unsung. Centuries of enlightened ones. And there's nothing about Zen practice nor awakening that makes it exclusionary to certain categories of people. From the very beginning, there's not a single thing. The only way there can be exclusion, separation, division on the basis of sex, gender, race, class, age, and so on. The only way that can happen is through the filter of thoughts. Conjuring up and clinging to ideas, mental constructs about have and have not, should and shouldn't, right and wrong, good and bad, this and that. But our true nature cannot be limited or confined or put into categories in any way. It's beyond all of that. It excludes nothing and no one. So when it comes to the history of exclusion and marginalization of women, not just in Zen, but in most of the world's great religions, as well as in other realms of life, such as work and politics and so on. It's all a product of conditioning, social conditioning. Traditions, customs, patterns, habits of mind that were preserved by cultures and societies and get passed on from generation to generation. And they're manifested in our thoughts, our speech, and our actions. And they're difficult to notice and therefore also difficult to let go of. Because we take them to be intrinsic to who we are, to how things are. They're reflected in all the assumptions that we make about one another. For example, the assumption that women are supposed to be fragile and emotional, whereas men are supposed to be strong and rational. It's a kind of binary thinking that plays out in a lot of different ways. And it's also a form of ego delusion. We end up projecting stereotypes and biases onto other people in service to our own self-identity, but also onto ourselves, because we can internalize them. And as a consequence, we can contribute to our own oppression. We do that to the extent that we buy into ideas about differences. Another aspect of this delusion is just the fact that we put people into neat, tidy little boxes in the first place. Counting only to 2. Not seeing the whole spectrum that is gender and sex. And it's a form of control, really. Social norms do provide us with a sense of order. So it gives us the illusion of being in control. We want our social world and all of our interactions to be predictable. We become uneasy when people don't fall into line with the order of things. That is how we think it should be. In early Buddhism, within a culture that valued masculinity over femininity, women were seen as obstacles to men's practice. In a monastic setting especially, nuns were generally separated from the monks, so they would not serve as a potential distraction or, say, temptation for the monks, as if they were responsible for the monks' reaction to them. And the story of the Buddha's enlightenment also has aspects to it that reflect the patriarchal culture at that time. He left his wife, leaving her to raise their newborn son on her own, and he renounced domestic life altogether. And we might be inclined to judge him in a negative way for this, because it goes against our ideals of the family unit, including parental responsibility and loyalty to one's spouse. And we might even see his actions as a form of abandonment that caused significant harm to his loved ones. But that's not the whole of it. We can also see Siddhartha Gautama's departure from his family as a desperate and courageous act of renunciation of worldly and material life. He saw it as necessary. He believed that it was what he needed to do in his quest for enlightenment. And later on, as the story goes, and we don't often hear this part of the story, but it is said that his wife became a nun and his son became a monk. They both became devoted followers of the way, and they both realized their true nature. Of course, with the historical record being what it is, we don't know how much of this story is the stuff of myth. But that doesn't minimize its value to us. The story of the Buddha, most importantly, points us in the direction of letting go of attachments. In whatever form or way that might look like in our life. And one certainly doesn't have to leave their family or become a monastic in order to wake up. Actually, monastic practice, you can say, has its limitations because on the one hand, the structure of it does enable one to focus on one's practice with intensity, being supported by the structure and by the Sangha in a way that is more difficult for a householder or a lay practitioner. But on the other hand, what happens when the monastic exits the gate and goes out into the world? Are they equipped to integrate their practice in this social world that is unwieldy and not so structured? That's one of the things I've grown to appreciate about our center. Thanks to Kapleau Roshi and Bodhin Roshi, there's been this tradition at our center of finding the middle way, holding on to tradition when it comes to training, holding on to structure and order, but not too tightly, making adaptations in a way that fits with this American setting and with present-day life in general. Thus, we have all this technology in the Zendo. So now let's look at Master Moshan Liaoran, who, as a woman, was a real pathbreaker. She lived in 9th century China in the later years of the Tang Dynasty, which was regarded as the golden age of Zen, a time when Zen, or Chan as it was called, was flourishing with the development of distinct schools and traditions and also koan practice. Politically and economically, though, it was a time of great hardship. There was no centralization of power. There were conflicts, rebellions among various independent regional factions. And yet Chan thrived in that environment. And it makes me think of what's happening now. There's a lot of division and partisanship, clashing of beliefs and values. Also chaos and fear sown by the federal government. And some people's lives are being upended by it. And yet, such circumstances can be the very thing that drives one to practice. To have the determination to see through all that delusion, all that separation. There's very little biographical material about Master Moshan. One source is a short entry about her in the book, Zen Women, Beyond Tea Ladies, Iron Maidens, and Macho Masters. The author, Grace Shearson, says, although we know nothing of Moshan's early life, her life as a woman, or how she came to practice Zen, her status as a teacher is unquestionable. Now, to put this in perspective, there are many male masters that we likewise know very little about. And that's because the historical records are minimal from that time. It was a time in human civilization when the spoken word, not the written word, was the primary form of communication. So as a consequence, there was a lot that wasn't preserved. And some of the stuff that was preserved may not even be fully accurate. There are some really inspiring stories, though. Based on what is known about Moshan, Shearson says she was tough as nails, a female Zen master who matched the strongest of male masters. And her very name gives us a clue to this. The name Moshan translates as summit of the mountain. So she was legendary. She's even mentioned in the Transmission of the Lamp, which is a large multi-volume text that recorded the dialogues of the early masters. And it's a text that dates back to the Song dynasty. But I'm going to use instead Andy Ferguson's translation of his from his widely respected book, Zen's Chinese Heritage. And that includes some snippets about Moshan in it. The most famous story about her involves a monk named Guanxi Xian, who first studied with the founder of the Rinzai school, Master Linji. Ferguson says that after training with Master Linji, Guanxi went off traveling on pilgrimage, which was a common practice at the time, visiting various teachers and temples, and eventually he came upon Moshan's monastery, where she was the abbess. So she taught both women and men at her monastery. Typically, in 9th century China, as I mentioned earlier, monks would have lived and practiced separately from the nuns in separate areas of the monastery complex. And on top of that, there was a distinct hierarchy. The monks were ranked higher than the nuns, while the nuns were ranked higher than laymen and laywomen, so all lay practitioners. And then traditionally, because the monks had a higher status, it was not appropriate for them to bow to a nun. On the other hand, a nun was expected to bow to a monk to show their respect. And the nuns were also not allowed to correct or critique monks for their behavior, but monks could do so for nuns. But here we have Mother Moshan, a woman serving as the head of the monastery, the installed abbess. And you can't help but to wonder if the social dynamics at her monastery were any different. For example, did the nuns have more privilege or higher status there than typical? And you could also see the predicament for a monk serving as a student or a disciple of an abbess at that time. That would require some real letting go of gender norms. And as far as the historical record goes, Moshan is recognized as the first female master to have transmitted the Dharma to a male ancestor. And that male ancestor was Guanxi, who was also a Dharma heir of Linxi. Andy Ferguson quotes Guanxi as saying, "I received half a ladle at Father Linxi's place and half a ladle at Mother Moshan's. Since I took that drink, I've never been thirsty." So that's where the reference comes from to Moshan as mother. Guanxi expressing his gratitude to his two teachers, his father and his mother, Linji and Moshan. Two halves of a ladleful. Taking that drink and never being thirsty again. So what was in that drink? You might think it would have to be something very, very special and extraordinary. something that you will never get to taste. But as Harada Roshi famously said, "For 40 years I've been selling water by the bank of a river." We think we're lacking something, that there's got to be some special place we have to get to. Somewhere other than this ordinary place right here. That's just a thought. It's a rather sticky thought for a lot of people, but it's in the end just a thought. And it's one that you can drop, just like all others. Next, Ferguson recounts this dialogue between Moshan and Guanxi that appeared in the lamp records. It begins, "Once the monk Guanxi Xian arrived at Mount Mo." Mount Mo, just like mother, is another reference to Moshan. Mount Mo literally refers to her temple, but you can also see it as referring to her, as in she herself is the summit. Guanxi arrived there at Mount Mo and said, "If there's someone here who's worthy, I'll stay here. If not, I'll overturn the meditation platform." He then entered the hall. So this sounds like a Dharma duel. You can kind of picture Guanxi swaggering into the temple, trying to stir up some action. And for those of you who don't know what a Dharma duel is, it's an ancient tradition that dates back to Zen's Chinese ancestors. Monks who went on pilgrimage, as Guanxi was doing, would try to find enlightened masters and other monks that they could engage with as a way of deepening their own practice. So it would often take the form of an exchange, which could involve just words, but also gestures and or actions. It could be an exchange between a student and a master, or two masters, or more than two masters. And we can see it as a kind of competition where all the participants win. They win because it's intended to test and clarify their understanding. So even when someone ends up exposing their own delusion, they win because they see it. And these dialogues that were recorded were the basis for the koan collections that we continue to use today. But back to Guanxi. So he's showing some bravado. He's basically saying, "I'll stay and practice here at Mount Mo if someone, anyone, in other words, Master Moshan herself, can demonstrate understanding that exceeds mine." But of course, we don't really know if he actually has insight to begin with. It's possible that he was just kind of imitating what he's seen other masters or monks do while he was on pilgrimage. Anyway, Moshan sent her attendant to query the visitor, saying, "Your Reverence, are you here sightseeing? Or have you come seeking the Buddha Dharma?" To which Guanxi said, "I seek the Dharma." Then Moshan sat upon the Dharma seat, and Guanxi entered for an interview. In other words, she's about to test him. And notice that she addresses him as "Your Reverence," which is a term of respect. But what she's really doing is setting him up. Moshan said, "Your Reverence, where have you come from today?" There are a number of dialogues that begin with that ordinary question, "Where'd you come from?" It's a natural question to ask in the context of all these monks coming and going on pilgrimage. At the same time, how one answers is also an expression of their understanding. By the way, nuns also went on pilgrimage, not just monks. But there are very few recorded stories about their travels and their dharma exchanges compared to that of monks. So Guanxi replies to her question, "Where did you come from?" He says, "From the intersection on the main road." Now, that's an interesting response because he didn't say, "Oh, I came from such and such temple or province." He says, "I came from the intersection on the main road, the crossroad, that road that connects with all other roads." And with a crossroad, you can't say that it's one road or two roads or more. So that's not a bad start for Guanxi. Next, Moshan says, "Why don't you remove your sun hat?" And Guanxi didn't answer for some time. Why don't you remove your sun hat? It's like saying, expose yourself. Show me your true self. Show me your understanding. And to that, silence. Why didn't he answer right away? Was he faltering? There's a sidebar comment in this exchange that says, later, Shushan said, "The battle begins here." Shushan is another master in the Linji lineage, and this comment was apparently made at some later time. Could be years later for all we know. And so he's looking back at the exchange and saying, this is where the Dharma duel really begins. When Moshan says, "Take off your hat. What do you have to hide?" Finally, Guanxi removed his hat and bowed, saying, "What about Mount Mo?" He removes his hat and bows. A monk bowing to a woman who is also a Zen master. How often would that have happened in that time and place? So it really speaks to Guanxi's sincerity and is not being caught up in ideas about Moshan as a woman. And then he asks her, what about Mount Mo? What about you? What is your understanding? And she replied, the peak isn't revealed. The peak isn't revealed. So she answers with negation, saying not what it is, but what it's not. It's not revealed. Our true self is no self. It's beyond any ideas we might have about it. And also, in making that comment, the peak isn't revealed, she could be commenting on Guanxi's understanding, saying, this guy hasn't seen the summit yet. He's caught up in his ideas about the peak. But Guanxi persisted, and he asked, who is the master of Mount Mo? So again he's asking, what is your understanding? Who is the master of the summit? What is this true self that is no self? So he's determined, he's genuinely seeking her guidance. And in response to this question, who is the master of Mount Mo, she said, without the form of man or woman. Guanxi then shouted and said, why can't it transform itself? He's sounding pretty desperate. If it's not a man nor a woman, if it has no form whatsoever, how can one come to know it? How can I experience it? What is it? And to that, Moshan said, it's not a god or a demon, so how could it become something else? It's not this, and it's not that. It's beyond good and bad, right and wrong, this and that. How could it be other than this? Just this. Things as they are. And at that, Guanxi submitted to become Moshan's student, and he worked as head gardener for 3 years. And that's the end of the exchange. And that he became her student is pretty remarkable, given, again, the gender customs at the time. And eventually, as his practice ripened, he saw the summit, and he became Moshan's successor. And he never forgot that half ladleful that he received from her. There's another exchange involving Moshan, but we don't have time to get to it this morning. I want to close with a verse in praise of her. It's translated also by Andy Ferguson, and it comes from a classic text called Guz Ansu Yulu. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but it's the recorded sayings of the ancient worthies. And here's the verse. Mount Mo does not reveal its pure summit, but through all time, the pinnacle is before the eyes. It's said it has no male or female form, but do distinguish the lotus amid the flames, without form, without mind, without intention. Becoming male or female just accords with conditions. These times are replete with monks and lay practitioners. Each one shines with flawless incandescence. These times are replete not just with monks and lay practitioners, but nuns, women, mothers, and sisters, and also practitioners of all sexes and genders. Each and every one, without exception, shines with that same flawless incandescence. Each and every one. We'll stop here and recite the 4 vows.